Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today's topic is going to get a little bit into the weeds on not only how to do ROI shooting in Nina, but also covering a little bit of a journey on equipment and how to maximize the gear that you have and how to manage multiple rigs with less equipment overall. So before we get to the ROI portion, and what led me to this topic was one, I saw various folks out on cloudy nights and other places talking about how do you shoot ROI. That led me to research it out, and there's multiple ways, not only in Nina, there's other ways, but this is only going to cover Nina with a plugin called Sequencer Powerups, which I highly recommend you add. It gives you the ability to do not only ROI, but you can do coordinates within the sensor. I'm just going to focus here on a percentage. So if you wanted to make a more rectangular shot, that would be a way to do it. So before we get into that, I want to cover where I'm going with my gear. It all started back during COVID, fall of 2020, and my friend got me into this hobby. I was actually thinking about telescopes, not in the sense of automated telescopes and what we see people shooting on Astrobin, but just like basic usage. I didn't even realize all this stuff was out there. But then he showed me that he had gotten into it. He had a GT71. He recommended I start off with a refractor, and after seeing his photos and the field of view he was shooting, I decided to get the GT81. I researched a ton, eventually got the 81, fully automated it, had it for a couple years before I eventually, and I have the 1600 Pro for this camera, which has some limitations. Probably my next thing I do will be replace that camera, which is part of what this video is going to cover, is like what camera should I get. A couple years into the hobby, a couple years ago, I added a second telescope, and still in the refractor series, William Optics 132. Love this telescope. I ended up going with a 1x flattener instead of a reducer because I wanted a deeper view of the sky. And with this telescope, I also decided to learn how to use an off-axis guider. So I added the large off-axis guider from ZWO. I also moved up to the 2600 Pro camera with this setup. Took a little bit longer to adjust to the off-axis guider, getting everything optimized, but I now have it and it works well. So I'll often shoot with both telescopes in the same night. And that's probably a topic for another video, how to manage multiple telescopes in a night. And because of that, I'm often shooting different targets. But eventually, I want to get at least for now, it's still been on my list for last couple years, hasn't changed. I'm watching maybe get something even bigger than this, but the Celestron Edge HD 11, this telescope I can also use with these same cameras. So I could put the 2600 on there or the 6200 on there, depending on the target and how much of the field of view that I need. Also depends on the reducers. But the ideal camera for any of these telescopes changes depending on the target. I was thinking about getting another 2600 to replace my 1600 on my GT81. The more I thought about it, I'm like, why don't I go ahead and get the 6200? Well, the 6200 will be great for wide field shots of nebula, but I don't always need that. And the file size would be huge. Like, I'm not looking forward to dealing with processing on small targets. I don't really shoot wide star fields. I usually shoot deep sky targets, but again, it'd be good for nebula. And on the FLT 132, it'll be good for certain fields of view as well. With ROI shooting, I have unlimited options on the 6200 and then additional options on the 2600. So why would you want to shoot with region of interest? So you may have multiple cameras like I'm planning to have, one with a larger sensor, or maybe you only want to buy one camera, but you don't always need that massive field of view, and instead of processing all these extra massive files, you could just set the region of interest on the same camera and effectively turn a 6200 into a 2600, into a 1600, into whatever sensor size you want. The second reason you might want to shoot with a region of interest has to do with large sensor camera like the 6200 mm. Not that it's not ideal for planetary. A lot of people get a separate planetary. Maybe it's the only camera you got, and you're just putting all your money into one camera, or your first major upgraded camera, and you want to minimize how many of these you have to buy. So the 6200 does 3 frames per second. But my understanding is if you shoot with a region of interest, you can speed that up dramatically, because that's a factor of the files being saved off. In those cases, I believe you could go like 100 frames per second or more, of what I was reading on some of the forums. There's another reason you might want to do it. You can turn a slower camera into a fast planetary camera, or you maybe the camera's fast enough, you just don't want to mess with that. Now, the planetary capture software does this by default, where you can set a region of interest within the, like fire capture, you can set the region of interest within the program itself. So it already has that capability. Right. The third, it's similar to the first one, but short exposure times with hundreds of files, or maybe even 1,000 files, would take much less time to process, even if you didn't care about the storage. We could easily run a terabyte of storage on a multi-night shoot with a 6200 with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of files. That's our third bullet. A little bit of a repeat of the first bullet, but you'll have that. All right, a fourth one, and this is is a little bit, well, there'll be a fifth one too. The fourth one is you could reduce the crop if you have, you want to take your larger sensor and put it on a rig that does not support like 2-inch optical field of view, or an optical system is not large enough to handle that. So you're capturing the ring, exposed ring in the view. So you could set the ROI down to trim that out ahead of time and not waste your time with processing. And this can be, maybe you're transitioning between equipment and you don't yet have the new telescope, but you still got your camera, or from your newer telescope, or you just bought a new camera and you're going to upgrade your rig, but you want to shoot for a while with the new camera on the reduced optical system. So that could be another reason to do it. And then the fifth and final one, and this is kind of my case, is it can reduce the number of cameras needed to support various fields of views across various rigs. So I'm planning on having at least a third rig, and the ZWO series of cameras I have are interchangeable, including the filter wheels across those rigs. So if I want to use my 2600 as a base field of view, it's great. But when I use the 6200, I might not want to utilize the entire sensor, depending on the target, on the second or third rig, depending on what other cameras I have. So if I'm down to just the 6200 and I've already got a perfect feather setup on the first rig, I might want to do ROI reduction on that and still be able to capture without the burden of the file size. One of the reasons I didn't want to get the 6200 for a while is it's just that file size and what I'd be able to shoot with my 911 or my GT81. But after doing all this research, I'm like, I'm going to probably get the 6200. And yes, the filters will be more expensive, and I'll need a more expensive color wheel. But I future-proofed myself in that I have the option of shooting with that sensor as whatever size I want. I can make it a 6200 field of view if I want, or chip size, I should say, or I could use it for the full size if the target warrants it. And now I have every option available to me. In retrospect, knowing all this, instead of the 2600, I probably would have gotten the 6200 and done exactly what I said in this video. But I do need a second camera. I need to replace my 1600, and that has nothing to do with the size of the sensor so much as the issues with stars, really bright stars, cause it the micro lens, and it's not as efficient as the 2600 and the 6200. So before we get into the actual ROI configuration in Nina, which you can skip ahead in the chapters if you just want to get to that, I want to talk about file size. And this is part of the issue you run into when you get into the 62 megapixel camera is, a 1600 Pro really doesn't make any sense to worry about cropping. The file sizes are small. 2600 Pro, you can save yourself a bunch of room if you're shooting small targets with a smaller scope and you aren't looking for the wide field of view. So cropping in some cases makes some sense there. The 6200, we're looking at 2.5 times the file size. I have currently about 12 terabytes of storage on my mainline computer and other backup storage. And after a couple years of shooting, I've well overrun by even clearing out flat files and keeping masters. I've well overrun 4 terabytes with the number of targets I've shot. If you're shooting tiny targets, you can definitely save file space and tons of processing time especially if you don't have a powerful computer, by using ROI shooting on something like the 6200. All right, so now I want to show how to actually set up ROI shooting in Nina, and then I'll go for those who want to learn how to figure out the percentage ROI you need for a target. I'll go into some ways to plan for that with either previous photos or planning tools to determine the ROI if you don't already have a subframe of a target. So the way you want to do this is add the plugin Sequencer Powerups. Mark Blank made this plugin and it is fantastic. It does way more than what I want to show here, and I'm just started using it recently. But over on the sequencer, normally I'll have a sequence that goes through the routines, and I have the Crab Nebula up here, and Crab Nebula is really, really small on either of my refractors. And sometimes you want that wide star field, but say you just want to add some narrowband to just the core of it, and you want to shoot it fairly quickly in terms of, and then you want to reduce the amount of file storage in terms of the target. Well, you could set the ROI down here. So the subframe exposure, the basic command, allows you to do this, but the problem is it doesn't allow you to set the filter. So then you have to expand this routine by putting in more complicated, change the filter, keep track of all those things, and run through it. So you can do it without this plugin. So if we bring in Smart Subframe Exposure that Mark has added, you can now control the filter, and you can control, if you pick here, the ROI, and it defaults. The green are all default. So if I wanted to do 50%, I can put that there. And if I want to do 300 seconds, I could do that. And now I can replace my original hydrogen shot with that command. So I would just update these, and I'm actually going to replace these in all of my sequences and use it instead in case I ever want to do that. Now the other thing you can do is do dimensions, which allow you to pick an X and Y coordinate to start from and a width and height. Now I'm not going to cover this. I would test out with some sample images to see, get comfortable with how that works. So today we're just going to look at the ROI option. Well, assuming you set these up, copy this, bring this up, make another copy, bring that up, and then change my filter and get rid of my old commands. And now I've just upgraded it to do ROI shooting. So you run the sequence. You would also want to do the same thing for your flats. Now, the flat wizard doesn't allow ROI shooting. The advanced sequencer section, so you can do another section for your flats. And when you shoot your flats, all you have to do is change this to say flat and use, set your filters to whatever ones you shot before. Leave the ROI the same, and it'll match up the flat for that. The same thing for darks. You're going to want to shoot a dark library to match up if you're using darks. Now, there isn't a dark flat option in here. So in that case, if you really, really wanted dark flats, you could take a full-size flat, run those through a crop, but that seems really painful. I would just go with flats and darks in this process. That's how you do the Nina portion. Once you have your subframes in, process them like normal. Make sure you keep track of those flats and the dark library separate. And you might have several ROI configurations, which I want to talk about here. So in PixInsight, and if you use other processing software, it'll work for those as well. So in PixInsight, I'm going to look at a old sub with an individual sub with my 2600 on the FLT 911. So imagine I want to shoot more or want to reshoot this target. I just don't want this wider field. Don't want to waste time with it. But you don't know what the field of view is going to look like. So you can run dynamic crop and highlight the entire region. So you just do half the pixel size for the crop. So say 50% we want to look at first, or that'll be 3124, 2088 for your other side, and that'll show the field of view. You can make a determination from looking at a previous sub and decide what you want it to be. Maybe I wanted to do 75%, so 6248, 4686, 4176 times 0.75, 3132. And that would be the region of interest. So you could crop all this extra stuff. That looks like a pretty good one actually for this one. If I were on a larger sensor or didn't want to waste time on my 2600, even with those file size, that's going to radically reduce the file size. So you can crop that. Actually, let me undo that and hold the main image copy over here for a second. Then go back to this one, and if I crop that, I have this first version of it. Okay, this one, 3124, 1088, and if I run it, now I got another version of that. Close this out. Now we got these versions. All right, so here you can see 75 view. If you hold down on the top bar, it'll make it translucent so you can look through, get an idea of what else is out there if you want it in the frame. There's 75%, and you could do that for 50% and figure out for any particular shot how you want to do it. Now that's if you already have a sub you can look at. So how would you plan this out if you do not already have a sub of the target? The answer is within Nina. If we go to the atlas and look up the target, you can look up your target in here. Set for framing assistant. Set your camera parameters in here. You don't even have to have your camera connected, and that's going to give you a shot. You run the snipping tool and you take a new screenshot, and then just grab right inside this square, copy that. So this is set for the 2600, And I'm going to go back to, I'm going to save this file, copied it here. I'm going to save this sunflower Nina 2600. And then in here, I'm going to open the file. I have this representation of the field of view for the 2600, but not the scale, not the right pixel scale. Then you could go over to dynamic crop, highlight the whole image. So you want to make it 6248. And if you click somewhere else, you can see, so that's, and you want to make sure the other one's a little bit longer. So in this case, it's not as big as the other scale. So start with the first scale. Okay, so 176 for the height. And we want to apply that scale. Now this is the same scale, except it's a slightly off in terms of its actual dimensions. So I highlight it one more time. And this time I'm going to change the height is correct, 6248. If I really want to be precise, add that. And I just cropped it. And then we could go through the process we did before where I highlight the whole thing and I want to do, say I want to do 50%, 75%. We go through the same process here, which I'm not going to do. So that's the sunflower. Now the sunflower at 6200. Now this was taken off of Astronomy tools. So Astronomy tools, and it has the Messier objects in it. You can do the same thing. You can pick an object, but only the Messier target. So this is not good for this other cases. Then you could set your telescope up. So I have it set up to be the Edge HD11 with the I was prepping this with the resolution of a 6200 camera. So let me see. Let me add to view. So there is the Edge HD. The purple is the FLT 132. So if I were wanting to shoot with my FLT with the 6200, say it's the only camera I got, then I would potentially want to just crop those files down and then use the full width of the camera if there were some interesting things in the edge, or I was wanting to shoot a larger nebula. But even in the case of the Edge HD, you might want to trim some of these, but not so much. I took a copy of that file, of that image. I used snippet tool to bring that in over here. This is that view with the FLT 132 with the 6200 mm Pro, and I did the resolution changes to make it so I could see it, so I could plan it out. And then I could do, use the crop tool, check the percentages. You can also go into a program like GIMP, do the same thing with these images. If you're not processing in PixInsight, you can use another program to do that. And so there's another way to do it. Notice the crab. Here's the crab with a 6200 and a 2600 fields of view. Now these I did using the same process, only in Telescopius. The Telescopius is a great place to plan these things out. And then here I can play around with the camera. If you have multiple cameras, so you can just play around with which camera makes the most sense to shoot with. And in my case, I'm not using a reducer for my 911 and my 2600. This would be what I would shoot right now. But say I went ahead and upgraded my FLT to the 6200, moved the 2600 to my GT81. Well, first I could look at what does it look like on my FLT, and if I wanted to shoot those two telescopes together, maybe I would want to crop these files down, because just all this space is just not going to get, these edges are not going to get used. and it's a ton of space. So I could ROI shoot on the 132, and then if I wanted to get more data at the same time on my GT81 that's running the 2600, and it does have a reducer on it, 0.8, then look how small that is. So I probably want to ROI shoot that as well. Or maybe I only I reduce the region of interest on the 81 and keep the FLT 132 not quite as cropped. Maybe do 75% on the FLT 132, the 6200, do more on this one, and then combine those images. That's another way you can do this. So these are those fields of view. Actually, this one I hadn't scaled yet. You can see down here, 1326 by 880. But just from a perspective, size perspective, these are correct. There's how to plan out for the targets, figure out what ROI you need to use. I feel like me, you're in doubt of wanting to have this massive 62 megapixel camera and not always needing that much sensor and pulling in those big files. Well, you can turn it into a 2600 by doing ROI shooting. Coming back to these two cameras, having the second camera be the 6200 for me is going to provide all of the flexibility to shoot at whatever level. It's the same set to 2600, so I don't need two of these 6200s to do that, and so I've saved cost on the 2600. Now I might get as my third camera, when I get my third rig, I'll still have my 1600 I could use, but in reality, I will probably sell that and get a different camera, maybe with a larger pixel size for other reasons. Or I might get a one-shot color, play around with that, I don't know. If I don't do a different type of camera, I would probably get a second 6200 for my third rig. That would give me the flexibility to shoot two of the rigs with that full field, and then the 2600 can be whichever one doesn't need the larger chip for that night. And I plan on shooting all three rigs at the same time. And that's a topic for another video. I know I bounced around a lot, covering a little bit of cameras I'm looking to use, what rigs I'm trying to use, and it wasn't just about the region of interest, but the region of interest is a driving factor on my selection being the 6200 instead of just another 2600 for now. Originally was going to wait until I got the Edge 11 to get the 6200, but now I think I've convinced myself I get the 6200 next, and I don't have to spend all of that processing time on my current rigs in cases where that extra real estate is wasted. So that's a wrap for this time. Thanks everybody for watching, and those of you subscribing. I know I haven't made as many videos recently. I'm trying to step that up. It does come down to having unique content, as I don't want to just do what everybody else is doing. I may do some processing videos at some point, which would be similar to others, but I'm trying to look at unique angles, things that haven't been covered, and bring them to this channel. One of the reasons it's called T2 Exposed. Till next time, clear skies. Thanks for watching.